However you want to rank everybody. right. Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Well, welcome to the U.S. Institute of Peace. My name is Steve Hagee. Along with my colleague, Tonis Montes, we lead our Latin America programming here at USIP with a particular focus on Colombia and Venezuela. It's our great pleasure to partner with our esteemed colleagues this morning at the Washington Office on Latin America, the Inter-American Dialogue, and the Woodrow Wilson Center to co-convene this morning's public event entitled A Negotiated Solution for Venezuela, Prospects for a Peaceful and Inclusive Settlement. We thank you all for your interest this morning on what looks to be a rainy fall day. We actually didn't expect so many people to potentially trek from Foggy Bottom down here. We're really glad to see so many familiar faces and deep interest in this topic. We're bringing in a few more chairs to accommodate all of those that will be joining us. We apologize for being a little cramped in here. But if you have decided to join us here in person, or those that are following the event remotely via live streaming, you share our deep and urgent concerns for how once prosperous Venezuela has descended into a dramatic political, economic, and humanitarian crisis, one that the Western Hemisphere has not witnessed in its modern history. At this point, as much has been mentioned, there are over 4.5 million Venezuelans that have fled their homes over the last 5 years to seek international protection and or basic livelihoods across the region, including over 1.6 million in neighboring Colombia and more than 350,000 here in the United States. Nevertheless, a solution for this crisis has remained profoundly elusive, as Norwegian brokered talks between the opposition-led interim government of Juan Guaidó and the regime of Nicolás Maduro have been suspended for the last 2 months, and it remains unclear as to how and under which conditions they might resume. An uneasy stalemate has ensued as all sides try to reconfigure both the internal and the regional political dynamics to their advantage. The regional dimension particularly is increasingly alarming as we've seen not only a rise in xenophobia against Venezuelan migrants and refugees, but we're currently seeing social turmoil and political unrest in countries such as Ecuador, Peru, Chile be consistently associated with the Venezuelan crisis in the eyes of many officials and pundits. The untenability of this current situation across the region brings many of us back to the urgent challenge of definitively and sustainably resolving the crisis. However, the apparent lack of success in the monumental task of hashing out a political agreement between the regime and the political opposition, not only through the most recent Oslo and Barbados-based talks, but also previous iterations in the Dominican Republic. Understandably, the lack of success can lead to a deep and genuine skepticism as to whether such a dialogue-based settlement is actually possible, or even whether such attempts simply prolong the crisis and distance Venezuela from a definitive solution. In the face of our shared deep alarm about the current context and the challenges of a negotiated solution, it's easy to fall for the allure of simple narratives and easy solutions, including those which exclusively rely on the use of force. Today's event, however, is an attempt by our co-convening organizations to reaffirm that despite the bleak nature of the current outlook, there continue to be important efforts inside of Venezuela to create the conditions for a negotiated settlement, which would ultimately usher in the return to legitimate democratic institutions and leadership for Venezuela capable of reversing the tide in the crisis. In the view of the co-convening organizations, only an inclusive and peaceful settlement will ultimately translate into a durable and sustainable outcome through which a democratic transition would be sufficiently resilient and capable of warding off the inevitable challenges and deep resistance which it will face. Throughout the process of doggedly pursuing a negotiated settlement, strong public engagement on all sides of the political spectrum here in the United States, in Venezuela, and across the region affected by the crisis will be crucial to ensuring that stakeholders directly involved in such a process take into account robust constituencies in favor of a peaceful solution, as well as political consequences if future negotiations are undermined or not undertaken in good faith. This morning, we have the great pleasure of hearing from a select group of prominent Venezuelan leaders who have been working under the auspices of the Institute for Integrated Transitions, IFIT, in the pursuit of a peaceful, negotiated, and constitutional solution. IFIT is a Barcelona-based think tank that works on peace process and political dialogue worldwide. Since 2016, it launched the Venezuela Expert Group, an independent platform of 16 high-level Venezuelans based in country who seek to advance dialogue and a peaceful solution to the country's crisis. The group meets continuously to analyze the prospects for a negotiated settlement to the many challenges affecting the country, and to develop and disseminate realistic technical proposals that take account of the relevant international experiences and the specificities of the Venezuelan context. Although they will be introduced in greater detail shortly, I would like to warmly welcome our speakers, Pedro Niken, Michael Penfold, Margarita Lopez Maya, Hiram Gaviria, y Orlando Ochoa. We're also fortunate enough to have as this morning's moderator for our panel, Jeff Ramsey, who is WOLA's Assistant Director for Venezuela, where he coordinates the program's research and advocacy in Washington. Jeff is a leading expert on Venezuela's political crisis and has traveled regularly to the country since 2014. He is in close contact with actors working for an end to the crisis, both inside and outside of the country, and advocates for policies that advance a peaceful, negotiated solution to Venezuela's crisis, that address the urgent humanitarian needs of the Venezuelan people, and that support a humane response to the unique needs of Venezuelan migrants and refugees. Before handing it over to Jeff, I want to reiterate once again our gratitude to the Washington Office on Latin America, the Inter-American Dialogue, and the Woodrow Wilson Center for their vital efforts in making this event possible. Jeff, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Hello. All right, this is on. Thank you all for coming, especially on such a rainy, gray day. I wanted to pick up where Steve left off and just set the stage for our wonderful panelists today. We are marking almost 9 months since Nicolás Maduro assumed an illegitimate presidential mandate, and the U.S. recognized President of the National Assembly, Juan Guaido, as the legitimate interim president. Since then, those of us watching from abroad have, at least in my case, gone from tentative hope to deep frustration. I think there is an increasing acceptance here in Washington that the situation resembles, or is increasingly resembling, a stalemate. And I think there's also increasing acceptance that we've seen from WOLA that here in Washington and across the international community that a negotiated or pacted transition is probably the most realistic scenario. It's probably the most realistic outcome in Venezuela, and I think we're also cognizant of the fact that this won't be easy. In fact, to the contrary, it will be quite difficult. And it's going to take serious compromises and deep risks. But I think that's why we're here today. I think, at a moment of potential stalemate, I think what can help break that stalemate is creative thinking. And that's why we're so excited to bring together these experts from IFIT in partnership with USIP, the Dialogue, and the Wilson Center to explore the prospects for a meaningful negotiated transition in Venezuela today. With that said, I want to turn the floor over to our first speaker. I think we'll follow the order in the program that you all have, and I'll remind everybody that we'll have 10 minutes each, and I'll be relatively strict on time to ensure that we have enough time for questions after the event, or after the presentations. So our first speaker is Pedro Niken. Pedro is a professor and former dean of the Faculty of Law and Political Sciences at the Universidad Central de Venezuela. He is an active member of Provea, a leading Venezuelan human rights NGO, as well as an expert in international human rights and international mediation and arbitration. He served as president of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, the Inter-American Institute of Human Rights, and the International Commission of Jurists. He also worked as a legal advisor to the Secretary General of the United Nations in charge of the negotiation of the 1992 peace accord in El Salvador. With that said, I'll turn it over to you, Pedro.
Thank you, Jeff. We are here to talk about a solution for Venezuela. Understanding that solution means something other than just any outcome, I have no doubt that the only way to reach a solution must be built on negotiation and political agreements between the Maduro regime and the National Assembly, where the opposition won majority 4 years ago. I am not saying that is the best way, but actually the only way to recover democracy in the short term. A solution for Venezuela means recovering the stability of the country and the universal recognition of the institutions. Only on that basis will be possible to create the conditions for building trust, recovering the economy, and overcoming the social crisis in which the country is sunk. The best opposition victories have been electoral, and the worst opposition defeats have been insurrective. A negotiated political solution is, first of all, the most democratic. There is no other way to achieve free and fair presidential elections acceptable for all political parties in the short term. To have a new National Electoral Council that enjoys the confidence of the voters and the ensure international observation. In addition, negotiation is of the essence of democracy. It is in its DNA. Secondly, it is the best way to recover the legitimacy of the institution, since it would be done with the support of the most important political forces. Thirdly, and as a consequence of the above, it is the one that offers the utmost stability of the institutions, since this institution would not be exposed to the automatic challenge of other parties, as has happened today. Fourth, it is the most support of the international community and offers the most possibility of international cooperation for the reconstruction of the country. Fifth, it is the path that best prevents the political violence that has threatened Venezuela for several decades. And last but not least, it is the one that best favors Venezuelan problem to be solved again by Venezuelans. There is no other proposal or alternative that offers similar result. A political agreement for the recovery of a constitutional institution is the best for the country, and so should assume the leadership of the opposition and the government. This sounds naive because of the reciprocal accusation of bad faith along different stages of negotiation. But that's not enough to rule out the negotiation to solve the Venezuelan crisis. Indeed, good faith is not always present in political negotiations. Often, the parties that undertake this negotiation use unfair maneuvers to disrupt the other counterparties. Gracias. And yet the negotiation progress and an agreement is reached. The Venezuelan case is complex and difficult, but any negotiation is normally complex and difficult, both for the issues at stake and for the format and performance of the parties. The difficulty of negotiation in Venezuela comes not only from the issues at stake, but also that the parties do not yet have negotiation as their plan A, but as an alternative to other more attractive plans. These more attractive plans have something in common, which is the total defeat of the other. I mean, the disappearance of the democratic opposition or the disappearance of Chavismo. This is neither possible nor convenient. I will not dwell on the condition that the negotiation of Venezuela must meet. I will only say that there are three indispensable requirements that the first is trust, which separates abysmally the parties. In order to establish it, the support of the intermediary is essential, particularly from Norway. I think that if the negotiations restart, Norway should be reinforced by international friends as United States and Russia. The second is the determination of both parties to assume the negotiation as their plan A, as their main commitment. The third is incentives, positive and negative, such as warranties to losers of elections. In this area, the sanctions deserve a special mention. Imposing sanctions is a negative incentive, but that can become positive when it comes to lifting the sanctions. In order not to extend myself, I do not believe that the sanctions imposed on the Maduro regime reached the result of bringing down the government, but they have been what brought it to the Norwegian table. Similarly, the intelligent and progressive lifting of the sanctions can be the incentive for Maduro to make concessions at the negotiation table. However, to conclude this comment, I must warn about the effects of the sanctions which aggravate the suffering of the people more than that of the Maduro clan, and in addition, provide the regime with a tool to blame the opposition and the United States for economic hardship. In the short term, the political effect of the sanctions within Venezuela can be reversed against democratic opposition. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Pedro. Next up, we have Michael Penfold. Michael is a professor of political economy and governance at the Instituto de Estudios Superiores de Administración in the School of Business and Public Policy in Caracas. He's an expert in Latin American politics and economic development and a visiting professor at the Universidad de los Andes School of Government in Bogotá. He is also a global fellow of the Latin America program at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Michael?
Thank you, Jeff. It's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to share with my colleagues from Venezuela on this panel on a negotiated solution for the country. And obviously, some of us, not all, but some of us are at despair to the fact that the negotiation process stalled and basically has collapsed at this point. After August, September. And the reason for the despair is basically that that the process, the political conflict in Venezuela might continue to intensify in the next months, while both parties continue to explore what they still consider their best alternatives, which is, in the case of Maduro, who has been able, with some minority groups from the opposition, to install a rump table, to call for early parliamentary elections, and hoping that international conditions continue to change in order to accommodate some kind of new status quo. And the opposition hoping that the international pressure will continue to increase, and that based on that, some effect, either social or political on the domestic front, might turn the fortune towards some kind of political transition. But the truth is, as Pedro was saying, is that those plan A, which seem seductive for both sides, still look unlikely, and the despair also arises from the fact that if there is no negotiated solution, which not necessarily means it's the best solution, it does mean that without that, we're going to continue sort of in a situation that it continues to deteriorate at a very fast pace. Just to give you an idea, Venezuela's GDP right now is $60 billion. 5 years ago was over $240 billion. So we're talking about a real dramatic contraction in Venezuela's economy, with all the social consequences that you can think about. But it's a contraction that has also another side to it, which is the growth of an illegal economy, which it continues to grow. It's been growing. And a country where is struggling with hyperinflation, but that after now almost 2 to 3 years with hyperinflation is starting to dollarize also very quickly. And with a migration that is so large that the social pressures over our neighbors are now starting to become quite evident. Serious migration, Europe can absorb that migration because it has the infrastructure. It has the job market. Absorbing Venezuelan migrants from now on is going to be extremely difficult, in part because the region doesn't have sufficient infrastructure and a dynamic economy to absorb that kind of migration. So on the domestic side, what we're observing is this rapid deterioration. And on the political side, the inability of both sides to win the conflict. Both sides have plans, but both sides so far have failed in achieving their first order preference. So the question really is, can they actually commit, as Pedro was saying, can they actually commit to a second order preference? Can they actually engage in a negotiation process in a meaningful way? Well, the good news is that despite the adversity, both sides secretly were able to put together these talks. And it was done very carefully for a Caribbean country that is used to play baseball in a Caribbean way, which means rules are good, but they're not so good, right? You always are trying to turn the corner. It means that we have a rule-based process with a clear agenda. And an agenda that originally was put in place with a shared goal, which was both sides accepted, when they went into those talks, both sides accepted that the constitutional rule in Venezuela was broken, that the only way to restore order, that the only way to restore economic growth, the only way to address a humanitarian crisis and the social consequences was by coming to terms with an agreement that restored institutions and that was able to delegate, again, to independent bodies of government and legitimate bodies of government in a democratic way, the rule of law. That was the basis of that agenda. And that was a good news, but it failed. Or it's in, at least, let's say, it's in intensive care. So how can we resume these talks, if possible? And I'll try to mention some few ideas of how I think talks might be resumed. First of all, I think it's going to take time. Before, both sides continue exploring their plan A, it's going to take time. And they come back to the realization that life is not going to get better in Venezuela. And it will not only take time, but it will, again, also take a lot of diplomatic effort to get this together again. I think the talks in Venezuela started with an original sin. The fact was that they were secret and they were made public unintendedly. And the fact was that none of the parties had entered the talks by providing confidence-building measures. Therefore, there was no cost for entering into the talks, no cost for leaving the talks. So I think, first of all, any resumption of the talks is going to require important confidence-building measures that allows both sides to truly commit to this process. Secondly, I think it's going to require international alignment. The fact is, the US has a view on what's the best solution to the Venezuelan crisis. The Europeans have a similar but quite different view. And then you have the Russians, the Chinese, and the Cubans, and the Colombians also, and the Group de Lima, with views that are different from each other. It's going to require alignment. The good news, I think, is by the time it becomes evident that the plan A for both sides is not working, the pressure on most neighbors in Venezuela to come up with an alternative is also going to grow. So that means that we need some international alignments to support this process. On the domestic side, the negotiation process is a process that has spoilers on both sides. So you need domestic stakeholders. You need factors that actually believe that this is the best, or this is the way out to Venezuela's governance crisis, deep governance crisis. And that implies that there's also political commitment on both sides to do this. There's a recent approval by the National Assembly openly claiming that this is what they're supporting. And I think that's a good step, but it's going to require more than that. It's going to require that also on the side of Chavismo. It's going to require that also from different actors within Venezuelan society. Fourth, I think it's going to require redesigning the teams. Because both teams, I think, were extremely professional on both sides. They were very rule-binding. They were very trustworthy of the mediator, which I think is the biggest asset we have now in this case, which is both sides accept that Norway is a trustworthy negotiator, a mediator. So, but the problem is that we have a rump group now. So it's a tactical strategy by the government. It's a rump group where basically the government or the regime is trying to give away unilateral concessions without going through the Oslo table. But it's also dealing with substantive issues that in theory should have been on the Oslo table, like, for example, the electoral body, the National Electoral Council. So restoring negotiations with that rump group or that rump table in place is going to be very difficult. So you need to address that situation. It's going to require creative solutions, but it has to be good solutions. The worst solution to that problem is going to be redesigning the agenda or redesigning the rules of the game. That's the only thing we have. The moment we open up the agenda again, we open up the rules again, I think the whole process is going to continue to falter. And I'll conclude with sanctions. I'm not either for or against sanctions. I'm not going to take that position. I think we have to be realistic about what sanctions can achieve and what they cannot achieve. The track record of using sanctions for regime change worldwide is very poor. Sanctions can help to bring parties to the table, but they're not good at determining what the table should be about or determining the outcome ex ante of what the negotiations should be about. So this is going to take a more realistic acceptance of what sanctions can do and how they should be used. And also, I think we need to think sanctions from a different perspective, which is also positive incentives. And I think it has to be clear from the international community exactly how these sanctions will be removed and how they can come along with more positive incentives in terms of international financing, humanitarian aid to support Venezuela's reconstruction. Having said that, I'm not saying that it has not been put on the table, that it has not been mentioned, but it needs to be better integrated, particularly because the truth is that sanctions are biting. There have been tremendous effects of these sanctions, particularly the secondary sanctions that started in August. So I'll leave it there. I think the homework needs to be done. The good news is, at some point, while both parties were in conflict, people were doing the homework and setting up the talks. I think we need to get back again to doing that homework and reframing the process in a way that actually can help the country move ahead and start what people really want, which is the country to be able to have democratic institutions, to restore growth, and particularly to stop the humanitarian crisis, and to start the fractioning of the Venezuelan families who are basically torn apart by the migration process that is taking place in Venezuela, and that is very, very sad. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Next, we have Margarita Lopez Maya. Margarita is a member of the Technical Advisory Council for the Political Studies Center at the Universidad Católica Andrés Bello, the UCAB, and she participates on the board of the Latin American Social Sciences Council, CLACSO. She's been recognized as a leading expert in modern Venezuelan history, especially of the Chavista era. Margarita?
Good morning to you all. First is to say that I'm very glad to be here. I'm very thankful to the institutions that have put together this panel, so we have the opportunity of discussing, once again, the problems of Venezuela. And as a historian, what I want to do today is to present basically the forces that are behind the two actors that go to the negotiation table, and how the situation that makes possible a way out in a peaceful and inclusive, and I would say democratic way that makes possible to put down the foundations for democratic transition, has to take into account that one of the great problems that we have is that the balance of forces between the two actors is very unequal. And that's what I want to focus on. Even though one may feel that the Maduro government is isolated in the international realm, and that the opposition has become more powerful, the truth is that in the domestic realm, Maduro has the upper hand very clearly. The concentration of power in Venezuela today is very strong. The dictatorship controls 20 of the 24 governorships, as you may know, more than 300 of the 300 mayorships. He has a very clear support of the armed forces. There may have been discontent, desertions, generals put in jail, but what we see in the high commands is that there's a very clear backing of the regime. The other elements that we see that are very important is that the main income of the economy in Venezuela are in the hands of the dictatorship, which is oil and now mining. That the dictatorship also controls a very sophisticated and has invested a lot of money in a very sophisticated media or propaganda apparatus that practically puts the Venezuelan common people in the information that the government wants them to hear, which is this fictional world in which we are pretty good, and we would be even more happy, right, if this war of the empire and the evil against us wouldn't be going on. This is repeated and repeated. This is a very totalitarian propaganda apparatus, what Maduro has. And of course, one of the most important things that explains the atmosphere that we are bringing today is that it has a very sophisticated, wide, repressive apparatus, which goal is to sow terror in the common Venezuelans. It is not just that the armed forces, especially the National Guard and the Army, are thrown into the street to repress the civilian, unarmed, and nonviolent protests with those heavy death tolls that we have seen, but that today they work in compliance and in coordination with militias, with civilian armed groups, with paramilitaries, and even with criminal gangs. And so this is one of the explanations of why, together with the failure of the table in Barbados and the hardships of everyday life, has put the Venezuelans in a reflux at what has to do with mobilization today in the country. As I say this, he also has important allies. But let's go now and cross the street and see what are the forces vis-a-vis when the opposition sits down in the negotiation table. And then what we have in the first place is, of course, that powerful international alliance that has been put together, and that this year has been particularly positive in the sense that not only we have the U.S. as a main partner there with the sanctions that have been playing on, and as Michael has said, gave the possibility of Maduro sitting down. It brought him to the table. But we also have the Lima Group, we have the European Union, we have several other governments that are working more or less in coordination together, something that we had not seen before. This year we saw more consensus among the international actors, and we saw a little bit more of coordination. More work has to be done in this regard, but this is one of the most important assets that the opposition has. The second positive thing with which we are ending the year is the leadership of Juan Guaidó. Last year, at the same time, the desperation in Venezuela and the atmosphere was worse, because we had all these hardships and we had no leadership. And so the emergence of Juan Guaidó brought a unity between at least the main parties and brought some leverage to the National Assembly that is working today as the main institution that is backing the negotiations. And we see that the parties have been able this year to work in a united way, the main parties, what we call the Group of Four. But of course, and let me finish with the other positive aspect that I see. But as you see, this is very unbalanced. The government has all the power, and we have these assets, the democratic forces in the negotiation table. The other thing that was very positive this year was a team that was put together by the opposition to go to the Oslo table. It was the best performance of the opposition, we must say. It was a professional and honest team, a creative team that put a great effort in trying to bring the government to a negotiation. But I believe that, as my colleagues have said, even though the peaceful and inclusive settlement is the only way out of this situation that would be for the Venezuelans at the lower cost, I also believe that as I say, it is very difficult to accomplish when you have this unequal situation. And so we have to have creative ways out of this. In terms of the political parties, as I say, there has been positive because the leadership of Guaidó was able to put together the united action of the main parties and and put more strength to the National Assembly as the space where different parties could gather. We have problems with the political parties in Venezuela that keep on weakening the main actor at the negotiation table, looking for a peaceful democratic way out. And these are at least two groups, one very noisy outside, less important inside, which is the group that is called radicals, right? Those that do not believe in the negotiation, the party of Venezuela, the leadership of Maria Corina Machado, the personalities like Diego Arria, or the MAS party, etc. They do not believe in the negotiation. They say that that is a treason, that we go to negotiating with a criminal government, but we don't know very well what they want, because the signals of the international world are very clear that a military or violent intervention is not going to happen. But in any case, this weakens a lot and makes a lot of noise outside, because they have resources and they have some backing, especially outside, because electorally speaking in Venezuela, their relevance is secondary, I would say. But we have this new group that Michael has been talking about, the little table that we call in Venezuela, the big table and the little table, that opened up by a tactic of the Venezuelan dictatorship, which is today negotiating with the government under other. But they don't have the voting. The voting is in the main parties. They do have the power to harm any peaceful democratic negotiation, and we have to have this in account. Well, once we say that, I want to also say something that for me has to be also acknowledged and thought about in a more creative way, and it is what are the targets of the negotiation table that would make it possible for a breakthrough there, and not once and again standing up and leaving the table on the part of Maduro. And I think we have to understand that Maduro does not go to the negotiation table to leave power. That is not what he is thinking about. Put yourself in his shoes. With all this power, I mean, what do I want? I want the sanctions to be lifted up. I want the sanctions to be lifted up, and I'm willing to give some concessions for that. And in those concessions, you have to be clever enough to try to make the best of that and try to negotiate until you can get to your targets. And what does the opposition want? The opposition wants the government to leave. He wants Maduro to leave. And it doesn't have a plan B on this situation. So Maduro acts in the negotiation table with a clear purpose of taking out some concessions that would permit him to continue, and to divide, especially to divide the opposition. He doesn't have to win time anymore. He's got the time. There's no real threat to his power in the domestic realm and in the international realm either. So for me, he's not gaining power, and he's not taking care of his international image either. I think he is strictly going to the negotiation table to divide the opposition and to try to see if he can lift up some of the sanctions that these are doing harm to them. And so I would like, since these are very brief tips that we are giving here, I would leave it here, because I think that because the Oslo and Barbados talks have practically collapsed and put our goal further into time, we have to open our minds and think of another kind of arrangement and strategy to go to a negotiation table if we want, and that is what we are here for, looking for a peaceful settlement that will make possible for Venezuela to open the door to a democratic transition. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Margarita. Next up, we have Iram Gaviria. Iram Gaviria is the president of the Unión y Entendimiento Political Party, or Puente. He is a leading expert in agricultural development and international relations. Mr. Gaviria has served as Minister of Agriculture, a deputy in the National Assembly, and the Venezuelan ambassador to France and UNESCO. He has also served as the president of the Latin Union in UNESCO, president of the Confederation of Farmers, and a member of the board of directors of the Pro Venezuela Association.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the organizers. Thank you very much for you all for being here. Since its foundation on September 2015, the Union and Understanding Political Party, Puente, according to its Spanish acronym, has fought, together with other political and civil society organizations, for a peaceful, constitutional, negotiated, and electoral change in Venezuela. For Puente, Venezuela is going through a growing systemic crisis generated by erroneous public policies belonging to the model of the so-called 21st century socialism, not because of the sanctions. This crisis, sufficiently diagnosed and of general knowledge, can be seen in the drop of the internal production of goods and services, especially oil and agricultural and food production, hyperinflation, reduced buying power among workers, and an increase in poverty, the collapse of public utilities and services, oppression and violation of human rights, and the massive exodus of our fellow Venezuelans. To solve this systemic crisis, we must change our political direction and head towards a real democracy in compliance with our present constitution, whereby private property is respected, institutions are autonomous, human rights are upheld, and there is alternation of political parties in power through free, competitive, and transparent elections. Today, the current regime blocks that political change. The radical blocs of the official party, some of whom are even immersed in corruption and human rights violations, do not appear to have on their agenda any type of peaceful electoral rotation in power despite international pressures. In the face of this catastrophe, based on deepening socioeconomic and political institutional crisis, those of us who insist on a less violent path for Venezuela and the region, which will guarantee greater medium and long-term political stability, would like to propose the following in relation to the possibilities of political settlement. Specific proposals. A. The Venezuelan opposition should recognize and establish closer ties with moderates in the ruling party and honorable civilians and military figures. B. All parties should work to reactivate and foster the Norwegian-led process. C. Following the September 24th rejoining of the National Assembly by the ruling party deputies, the Assembly should appoint, in compliance with its internal and debate rules of procedure, a special parity commission, CEPAN, Comisión Especial Paritaria de la Asamblea Nacional. On behalf of the opposition, all parties in favor of a political negotiation should stand on this commission. The commission, the CEPAN, will be in charge of making proposals to the plenary of the parliament and to the rest of the organs of the state to make measures to reactivate the productive sectors, especially oil and agriculture, increase employment and buying power, improve public utilities and services, especially electricity and fuels, progressively normalize international trade, offer humanitarian care, reinstate the country's public institution, National Assembly, National Electoral Council, judicial power, citizens' power, set up the electoral schedule and its prerequisites. It means establish election dates for the deputies of the National Assembly and the President of the Republic, reinstate political leaders and parties, update the permanent electoral registry, and have international observers during elections. Dissolve the ANC, Constituent National Assembly. Give reasonable judicial and political guarantees to the ruling party members and its allies. D. Further to Articles 234, temporary absence of the President of the Republic, and 236, attribution of the President of the Republic, the ruling party and the opposition should jointly agree to appoint an executive vice president to coordinate and lead government until the newly elected President of the Republic is sworn into office. The new executive vice president would comply with the attribution stated in Article 239 of the Constitution, such as to appoint and remove ministers, coordinate relations with the General Assembly, and preside the Federal Council of Government. The executive vice president would effectively be the head of state and comply with the responsibilities stated in Article 236 of the Constitution. E. During the transitional period managed by the Commission, the CEPAN, and the Executive Vice Presidency, Nicolás Maduro and Juan Guaidó will resign from their respective offices on the understanding that both will be able to present themselves as candidates for the presidency of the Republic in the scheduled elections. According to the CEPAN, the Commission, how it performs and enforces the measures it deems applicable, efforts will be made to progressively lift the sanctions imposed on the Maduro regime by the international community. Finally, create the Friends of Venezuela International Group, GRIAV, as guarantor of implementing and complying with the agreements reached by the Commission. The Friends of Venezuela International Group could have the Kingdom of Norway as its coordinator and the following as members: the United States of America, Russia, the European Union, 2 countries of the Latin American and the Caribbean region, and 1 delegate of the Vatican and or the UN Secretary General. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Last but not least, we have Orlando Ochoa. Orlando is a leading independent economist and consultant based in Caracas. He has over 25 years of experience advising Venezuelan and foreign companies, including oil companies and financial institutions, as well as international agencies and foundations. In the past 3 years, he has worked on a plan for the recovery of Venezuela's economy based on oil, and has developed relationships with key national and international relevant economic institutions. Orlando?
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you to the 4 institutions that organized this event. Let me build up on what my colleagues have said and introduce some aspects linked to economics and oil. The Maduro regime has a plan A, which is stay in power, and a plan B, if it is forced to, which is get a safe way out. To stay in power, Maduro would need to have a sustainable situation. We are under, as has been said, under an economic disaster with a really social consequence that already have been mentioned. As Michael was saying, if Venezuela's GDP by the end of this year, we estimated at $60 billion, population 28 million, we're talking about $2,150 per head. Haiti is in 1800, so Venezuela is going in the direction to Haiti level. Of course, it's a shrink GDP. It could expand quickly under a reconstruction plan. Now, to stay in power Maduro and to see the incentive he would have to negotiate, let's first go a quick look at the international actors and factors. Russians are helping Maduro to deal with the situation. Rosneft is doing trade for Venezuelan oil, and Rosneft is providing gasoline for a very shrink market. I mean, Venezuela is consuming now a fourth, slightly less than a fourth of what it used to consume of gasoline and diesel. The Russians play a key role. If Maduro, even under the short term, would go into anticipated parliamentary elections, he needs to be able to have enough oil revenues and non-oil revenues to keep under this disastrous situation control on food supply, what the social programs they handle, CLAP and money handling through bonus. Okay. Now, the Russians has been helping, but the Russians, we have Rosneft, and we have also the political situation and let's see, the political aspects of the Russian relationship with the Maduro regime. The military is important, the Russians supply services, but we can see that the Russians are a bit hesitant about the sustainability of the Maduro regime. It's highly dependent on these oil revenues that are now in the hands of Rosneft support. Rosneft is getting paid for the debt PDVSA held with it. Chevron is getting paid by the debt that PDVSA holds with Chevron. CNPC, Chinese National Petroleum Company, is not getting paid since March because they simply couldn't arrange to keep transportation of payments in crude. China has been reluctant to support Maduro financially. But China has a sincere interest, long-term interest in Venezuela's oil supplied, heavy crude supplied for them, and they're interested in a partnership on oil, and of course to get paid. Now, if Maduro would hold to his plan A, he would need the Russians to stay there, supplying, helping him with these levels of exports, which we estimate around 500 to 600,000 barrels a day. Okay, production has been going up and down according to storage capacity and the facility, the speed with which they get tankers to move oil for exports. Under these circumstances, if he's going to an early parliamentary elections, he needs to keep this situation under control. Therefore, sanctions have done damage, but they still believe they can survive for a while and consolidate their political situation in the next 12 months, okay? And, however, domestic factors. The Maduro regime knows the economic disaster continues, the oil industry is collapsing, and given an initiative that we had 4 months ago, by IFIT, we made a presentation to them how we could see a possible economic and oil reconstruction of Venezuela. They show an enormous interest, and a table was set. But what used to be, or is still, the Boston Group, the parliamentary friendship between the US and Venezuela, with members of the assembly from the opposition and government, and there is now a permanent table on oil and economic issues that has been working for 3-4 months. What is the idea? Although we have no political solution or political negotiation that is leading, the government has put some of their best technical professionals in oil, central banking, some of their ideologists, some of their members of parliament, to discuss with a group of us, economists, engineers, and lawyers, on what could be, how would it look in the medium term, a reconstruction plan for Venezuela. Now, it's the first time in 20 years that we have managed to talk to government professional staff on central bank, oil, and this issue. Ideology comes in and out, politics comes in and out, but on these rational issues, we've been able to set a discussion table and to agree on certain things that might be useful in the medium term. But of course, we are not discussing who is going to rule Venezuela. We are discussing what could be needed to stop the collapse and the recovery. Given that if the Maduro regime would like to stay, either with him or with a successor, he would need to finance anything like this. Any transition that is led by Chavismo or any Chavismo regime that tries to continue will not have access to financial resources in the scale that is needed to recover Venezuela. If we make a rule of thumb, an approach, an oil recovery plan for 6 years, coming back to 2.3, 2.5 million barrels and developing gas and repairing infrastructure, would cost something like 160 billion in OPEX and CAPEX. It would need resources. And a stabilization plan, let's make a figure, 40 billion. A non-oil infrastructure and recovery of the private sector, probably around 50 billion, 6 years. So we're talking that we need a figure at least of $250 billion to recover. We have discussed this with them. They know they have no access to this. And as the Russians, when we have talked to them discreetly, they'll say they have no resources to finance anything like that. Even Rosneft, that has 5 oil assets, 3 oil fields and 2 gas fields. Rosneft has not invested the amount of money that would be required to develop this anywhere outside Russia. And the Chinese are reluctant to go in until we have a clear economic oil recovery plan and a political solution. Both Russians and Chinese talk about a negotiated political solution. However, Maduro can't think about staying in power if he has the Russian support, a limited Russian support. But if he wants to change the situation or at least stop the collapse of Venezuela, he would need to have access to some of these resources, which are very large. When we're discussing on these matters, I believe we could agree on how to make reforms to the legal framework for the hydrocarbon development in the future, which is useful because anything that happens, Chavismo will not disappear, will be there. So the fact that we are discussing subjects like coordination between economic and oil policy, plan to recover the hydrocarbon industry, economic policy, stabilization and public finance requirements, legal frameworks. Surprisingly, and we have members of the assembly from both sides, and all this stuff that I've mentioned, we could get to an approach of what would need to be done the day after, but we don't have a political solution. However, these are some of the rational aspects. If Maduro regime or anyone who comes after, if he plans to leave power to someone else, suppose on the transition, doesn't have access to financial resources, the only country close to them, but not that close, is China that could provide resources. And China is not ready to do that. And in any case, we would need the support of the IMF, oil partners, all of them. Okay. So I think they're coming to be realistic about this. They cannot stop the collapse. But there is a sector in Chavismo that believe that if they could sustain 600 to 800,000 barrels of oil exports, they could continue. That's the message they are passing to some of the partners. They could continue in a disastrous economy, but probably with a police state that would try to control this. Okay, this is exactly what we're trying to avoid. But we need to consider these kind of rational elements. Okay? Maduro's future depends on continue to export at least a fraction of what we used to export of oil, gold, and have some of these partners. Is it useful to talk to Russians, Chinese, and others? Yeah, we do think it. So, and they are part of the solution. The fact that, as Iran and Pedro suggested, we should think that any new process of political negotiations should have as guarantees the United States on one side, which is supporting, and the Russians, which are clearly, explicitly supporting them, or at least Rosneft. We're not completely sure whether the whole Russian government is completely happy with that. It is a fact. I think I'll leave it at that without question.
Great. Thank you, Orlando. We have about a half hour left for questions. I actually wanted to completely abuse my position up here and ask you all a couple questions that have been percolating in my mind as you've been talking. I have two questions in concrete here. The first is that you've all highlighted this this dynamic in which neither the regime nor the opposition sees as its plan A going to a negotiating table, at least for now. And I'm wondering, you've underscored ways that the Russians could apply more pressure for Maduro to get back to the table. It seems like his recent visit to Moscow didn't end as well as he would have hoped. There was some emphasis on the need to return to the table. But I'm wondering, clearly, the U.S. Has a role to play in this as well. What can the U.S. do in encouraging a negotiated solution and in ensuring that negotiations are moved back to the plan A? So that's one question. And then the second is a related question. We're entering into an election year in the United States, and I think it's pretty clear that because Florida is such a key electoral state in this country, we're likely to see some kind of saber rattling, some kind of, going back to the rhetoric of all options are on the table, talk of a surgical strike or so the kind of credible threat rhetoric that we've seen at times from certain elements here in Washington. And I'm wondering if you guys could just speak to what is the actual impact of that rhetoric on the ground. I mean, we at WOLA have been concerned because we, in speaking to individuals in the regime, I mean, they don't seem particularly worried. It seems like the people who are believing this rhetoric are exactly the wrong people that you would want to believe it. It's the opposition, and that's dividing them further on whether they actually need to pursue some kind of meaningful negotiation. So I just wanted to put those two questions on the table and invite anyone to provide any kind of insight.
I mean, you're right. It's U.S. I mean, the fact that the U.S. is entering into a presidential election where Florida is a key state, and and the Venezuelan vote there, even though it's not as large as other Hispanic minorities there, is relevant and it's very important, right? So bingo, we're part of U.S. domestic politics, and that's not always good news. Because it means that I think it's going to be very difficult to influence U.S. foreign policy in a way that adapts better to the reality in the ground. Okay, what can be done? First of all, I think that a way out has to be clear. I think we've always been thinking about negative incentives. I think we have to start thinking more about positive incentives. And I'm saying this not because, I'm naive. I'm saying this because there's not much room for more sanctions. Venezuela is as sanctioned, not quite, but almost as Iran, with a difference. where our oil industry was better integrated to the U.S., both its infrastructure and its exports to U.S. markets, whereas Iran is more integrated to Asia. And therefore, you know, for them, it's sort of bypassing some of these restrictions is easier than for Venezuela. But there's not much room there. Some people talk, well, more individual sanctions. So, okay, well, that's Europe. Okay? And so many people turn to Europe to do that job. But I think that at the end, really, if you start thinking about this in retooling, you need to retool in order to be more effective. So I think it's going to require that type of thinking. It's going to really require thinking out of the box in ways that the U.S. so far has not been able to do so. Having said that doesn't mean that what they've done is negative. It's just meaning that I think conditions on the ground are changing, and that's going to require a rethinking a lot about the policy. And I think the policy has to be realistic. You know, what that entails, what is acceptable, what is your goal, is important. But I think it has to account for what's really happening in the ground.
Just one comment. The last round of sanctions in August came at a moment when in Barbados they were trying to pass from the electoral discussion of some electoral issues to some most deeper ones of how to make a transition. When the sanctions arrived, the Chavistas understood that the U.S. could continue with sanctions, despite the fact that sanctions was probably the key reason why they came to discuss. And the U.S. probably understood that the message was, and I think that's what we believe and what we hear, is we are not going to act like the Europeans that are waiting for a solution to decide on sanctions. We are going to keep sanctions until you change. So the U.S. probably interpreted that it was building an incentive for change, while the Chavistas took it otherwise. And since there was a critical moment there, the understanding was not precisely the best. Therefore, I think it might be one of the factors that contributed to the disruption. And given that they really believe they can hold to Plan A, they can hold with their actual revenues, and they can hold for a while, enough to call for an early election for parliament, divide the opposition, as it usually does, between radicals and moderates, demobilize it, and defeat it, even with clean observers coming from Europe and others. If they are successful to do that, of course, they will put the opposition in a very weak and embarrassing position. And they also calculate that by the beginning of next year, Juan Guaido's popularity will be much lower, and that the U.S. might reconsider its role. Now, this is all dependent on keeping oil exports as they are, okay? And that the key actor there is Russia. And Russia does have political and military issues with Venezuelan regime, but it also has oil issues. Is Rosneft the only actor that matters in Russian foreign policy? We don't think so. So it could be useful to talk to Russia on these matters.
Just as a compliment, I think also that when we talk about thinking out of the box, I mean, this is a very fluid situation that has been going on in Venezuela. And I think when this year of 2019 opened, there was a very clear strategy, and it had some positive results, but now it seems as though it has been exhausted. And so I think that one of the things that the United States could do, and it would be very important, is to start thinking of other elements of the strategy. And in coordination, of course, with the main political parties in the National Assembly, because one of the things that happened this year is that the relevance of the international realm was higher than the domestic politics that was going on. And this is not something to say to the United States, but to the political parties in Venezuela. They have to take the lead on this. to recover a new kind of strategy. But I ask myself if, as I said before, the balance of power is so strong inside the country with Maduro, is it really fair to continue to think about the main goal of the negotiation to get rid of Maduro? I mean, you have to think of that, because actually it's an unrealistic goal, because he's too powerful, and everything depends on him and his group inside Venezuela. The military, for example, do not move because they are afraid. I mean, they are afraid that if they remove the top of this cupola that's in government, everything will just fall down. No, because they really don't have alternative leaderships inside the regime. And so I think that I'm just maybe putting it out in a way that we have to think of new forms of strategies and how we can accomplish this peaceful and inclusive and democratic transition, settlement, to go to a democratic transition. But we have to acknowledge that the situation is very uncertain, it's very fluid, and it's very innovative. Here we have Latin America going into a turmoil. I mean, next year is going to be a very terrible situation in Latin America. Look what just happened in Bolivia, my goodness. What has happened in Santiago de Chile, Ecuador, Peru. We have López Obrador doing these things in Mexico. I mean, the Cubans may be right when they tell Maduro, just stay in there and you'll survive. Because what we're seeing in Latin America it could be the beginning of again a new wave of non-democratic, more authoritarian regimes. So, but it's just as a point there to compliment.
Just I wanted to follow up on that one. I wanted to pick on Michael because I've heard you speak about this before, and I invite anybody else, since you are visiting from Caracas, to talk about this. I mean, what is the actual impact? You know, when you hear threats of a military option or all options are on the table, or this idea that there needs to be a credible threat to get the regime to the table to negotiate in good faith. Do these threats help? I mean, does that actually get us closer to getting a fracture in the regime, or not?
I don't want to be the dove on the panel, but let me say this: when you're trying to put together a movement to produce political change and to move forward a political transition, you want to build coalition, right? That's your aim. You want to build and amplify the groups that are supporting you, and that's a political thinking, right? A way of trying to, and once you have that, you can start, building on threats. But doing threats without having that in place is a risky proposition. So that's, what I'm trying to say here is that I think that you need to reach out. You have to make your project attractive to those key players that everyone knows that might make the difference towards that change. And I think that's one element that's not being in place. Second factor, credible threats can turn into credibility problems. Look at Syria. Okay, so this is basic. It's 101, right? You need to be careful how you frame this, the way you have to be careful of how you use this phrase that all options are on the table. There's a point where people need to know exactly those who you want to attract in order to make the change, where you're standing. Otherwise, you have a reputational problem. And this has been happening also within the opposition. It's very difficult for those who within that might want change to exactly what could work for them in terms of how do they fit into that coalition, and secondly, where do you stand? So without that, I think it's going to be very difficult to achieve what people want, which is political change.
Let me make one comment. There is one aspect that I see as an economist close to politicians, close to some of the negotiations. Recently, a few weeks ago, I talked to a Chilean politician that was very close to the process in the late 80s. And he said, when we won the referendum and we had to decide who would be the candidate, we would never think about a Marxist minister of Allende to be acceptable by the Pinochet's military. They knew they needed someone that not only could be elected, but would be able to govern. Well, when you listen to opposition and Chavistas, we find that there is a kind of Greek tragedy without gods and demigods, human characters. And the issue is, we know, they say, those guys are coming to kill us, and we don't trust them. And the guys in the opposition say, we know these guys are criminals, unrespectable, and they're not going to, and we know we need another way to do it. That's as critical as it gets. We don't have Mandela and de Klerk here. We have a human factor there, which I'm not going to talk in details, but is there. And we need to admit that that is an impediment. And the armed forces, when they have passed messages, they say, we don't like those radicals of yours. We don't like the Marxist radicals, but we don't like your radicals either, of the opposition. So I see that people do as if they are not listening. I just like to make that comment.
I just wanted to, I'll try to be very brief. I think here we have talking a lot about the signals that China and Russia have been sending about their interest in a peaceful negotiation out. And I think that when we talk about the international realm has to be more highlighted in the strategies of the United States and of our other partners. Because I think that if it is possible to include in these alliances, more coordinated international alliances, these major players in Venezuela that are the partners of the government at this moment, this would also bring some kind of more security to the armed forces and other actors that are in Venezuela that are making a lot of noise, but that are not breaking apart from the regime because they do not trust, like had just Orlando has said, we don't like the opposition, we don't like Guaido, we think he's a kid, you know? He's too young for the task of going to Venezuela. And besides that, he has behind Leopoldo Lopez, which we don't trust at all, no? And so we have been in Caracas, at least all the information and the rumors and everything, is that actually the Chavismo is very worried about the economic performance of the government, the disaster of the public services, and the migration. But when they look at the other side, they do not trust the actors that are there. And so if you try to put more inclusion of actors like Russia, that made a very clear signal with Maduro next to Putin, saying, we recognize the National Assembly, and we recognize the President Maduro. So they really put out a sign, we're not recognizing the Constituent Assembly of Maduro, but these are the two legitimate actors in Venezuela. Sit down and try to negotiate a settlement. And I think we should take advantage of that in the international realm and in the domestic realm also.
You recall Mandela, and I think that in Venezuela, perhaps we forget that the regime is very ideologic, very revolutionary, very epic. And for them, the threat of force has effect double. The effect of be afraid, but also the effect to be encouraged for fight. And I think that we have to have in mind always the ideologic nature of the regime, because it is very important. I think that Mandela try seduction instead of threaten. And I think we should think about that in Venezuela. We are making an effort in the civil society, meeting people, Chavista and opposition, and getting together the possibility of find some solutions for a small problem. But the result is very encouraging, because the people have necessity to be together. And I think that it's a point, the support of a civil society weak. Venezuelan, you know, or the organization of the civil society is very weak. But the support of civil society could be a key point in the Venezuelan solution.
So we've got time for a couple rounds of questions now. See several hands up here. I think we're bringing a microphone now. Let's start with Cindy.
Thanks so much to everybody. Cindy Arnson from the Wilson Center. A number of you have made references to what's happening within Chavismo, and my question is whether there's any sort of perceptible, organized movement maybe too strong a word, but strong current of opinion within the PSUV that says we can't abide the collapse of the economy, the collapse of the electrical system, the lack of food, the lack of medicine. I mean, the effect on the armed forces appears to be what it has been, but is there any sort of current that's perceptible within the party that could provide some sort of impetus towards a negotiated settlement or a break of some kind?
And why don't we take you in here?
That was wonderful, and I'm really excited, and I took notes. Peaceful, negotiated solution, no violence. I love it. I have a problem, though. In other words, you had there in my notes, realistic. I'm old-fashioned. I'm over 35, so I'm from the last century. Spent 30 years in the State Department, all dictatorships, so I know dictatorships. And I spent 2 years during Mariel in Havana, Cuba. I didn't hear anybody talk about Cubans. The Cubans there are nice. Our president doesn't like them, but they're really nice people. But the sons of bitches you have in Venezuela, my godson's Venezuela, I brought him out, he's in Miami. The Cubans you have in Venezuela are killers, are sons of bitches, that's not a diplomatic word, are bad guys, are crooks, are drug traffickers. They rape and kill people. Why doesn't that president of mine with the hairdo who's punishing, does sanctions, you don't like sanctions, on Cuba, why doesn't he get down and say, we'll lift some sanctions when you bring 10,000 of the 20,000 bad guys out and we click them in the airport when they come back in Havana and watch them? Why don't we do that? And why don't we read about Erdogan, that our president loves that guy who just invaded Syria. He's going to be here next week at dinner. Why doesn't that, my friend Elliot Abrams, say, gee whiz, you're on that list of foreign sovereign countries that love Venezuela? Why don't we tell him to knock that crap off?
All right. I I saw one more hand. We'll take those three. We'll take 3 questions and then open it up for the answers. I saw that hand in the back there.
Can you guys hear me? Thank you all so much for taking the time in your day. Thinking long-term reconstruction of the Venezuelan economy, what plans are there for diversification of the economy to relieve its dependency on oil revenues and fluctuations of oil prices? And what plans are there for kind of like restructuring the multi-layered and complex exchange rate that has pretty much created this clandestine market, illegal economy for U.S. dollars? Thanks.
So why don't we just do a round of answers? Or starting with Pedro, and we'll go. Okay,
I can try to answer that. But about inside Chavismo, the parties particularly. You know, this is difficult to answer because this is not a regular political party in a modern society. This is a charismatic party, basically, that was built by Chavez in order to push through his revolution. And once Chavez died, the truth is that is a party that is controlled by some of the higher civilians, Diosdado Cabello, and so on. But it really acts according to a very hierarchical, top-down dynamic. So there may be some people inside the party that are discontent, but they don't seem to have the capacity to put together a group in order to have some real incidence on the government. The government controls, in a very top-down dynamic, the party. There have been splits off of the party. I think the most important is the one. There are some there. They are very fragmented. They do not go together to the main political party alliance, to the El Grupo de los Cuatro. But we have, for example, I think these are the most visible, the party called, if you can remember, Movimiento Desafío de Todos, MDDT. It has a terrible name, but that is, of course, of the general Rodriguez Torres that is in jail. And that is probably the most important of the splits of the government. He is in jail because of that. I mean, he was thrown into jail, accused of conspiring against the government, trying to promote a coup d'etat. They form part of this civilian platform called Frente Venezuela Libre, Frente Amplio de Venezuela Libre, which is an attempt that now for about 3 years the opposition has tried to do to bring in civil society to articulate with the political realm. And so they do not align with the political parties of the traditional opposition, so to say, but this party does go to the Frente Amplio Venezuela Libre and has relations with other groups, especially with the unions that have been also gathering there. This is a platform that has been going on for 3 years. It is fragile. It hasn't been up to the expectations that we had in Venezuela, that they were going to articulate civil society with the political in order to get stronger the platform of the democratic forces. But Rodriguez Torres and his party go there. Not him, because he's in jail, of course. There is Nick Merevans' party, too, Movimiento por la Inclusión y la Democracia, I think it's his name. He goes also to Frente Amplio Venezuela Libre. But then we have all these little groups of ex-ministers, of Chavez, of ex-governors and so on that try to capitalize. But the truth is that the political expression of the discontent Chavismo is not being represented in any political party. It is my opinion.
Listen, I live in Venezuela. I mean, I survive in Venezuela. I think that nobody is more angry for the Venezuelan situation than us. It's not a matter of approach with angry the problem. I said and repeat, the best victories of the opposition have been electoral. The worst defeats have been insurrectionists. And we should take a lesson from that. We have to learn from that. And I think that, finally, I tell you, I have been in my life the opportunity to be close, very close to certain conflicts. El Salvador, 3 years negotiating to reach an agreement, happy agreement, excellent agreement. Burundi, after the massacre 1996. And I see that they negotiated after the deaths. I think that even if it sounds naive, but it's rational, we have to negotiate before the death. This is the reason because us very, in a way, very passionate, support the negotiation. It's not a matter of anger, of the brain.
Let me answer some of these questions the following way. It's not that I'm against sanctions. I don't think it's that simplistic either. You're for or you're against. It's how you think of them, how you work with them. Let me tell you this. In a way, I have the feeling that we're in a very similar position that we were after May 20th last year, after an elections that were illegitimate and with an opposition that was becoming increasingly divided. Most of them, some of them, very important leaders moving towards exile. And we thought that the international pressure by itself was going to do the trick. And the truth is that Guaidó and the opposition emerged in January this year strong, unexpectedly. No one was expecting that. Why? Was it because of the international pressure? Not really. What happened was, first of all, there was an effort to realign around the parliamentary pact between the four main opposition parties. There was an explicit effort, political effort, of doing that. Secondly, there was a process of trying to scout a leader that was acceptable to all of those parties. Third, there was an intention to frame January 10 as what it was, a huge constitutional crisis. And finally, there was an effort to mobilize the people, which did mobilize, around the assembly and around Guaidó as the interim president. And only after that, you had the international support to that process, out of 50 countries. When you mentioned Cuba, well, I like to think that Venezuela is different from Cuba, okay? That's the way I like to think about it. And one of the differences with Cuba is that we have a strong opposition, is that we have a national assembly, is that we have a society that is mobilizing around the need to restore democracy and the rule of law. I like to think that that is important. So if we don't understand that, I think the possibility of moving forward a political change in Venezuela is going to falter. Because without that, I think it's just hope. It's just going to hope that it's going to break down. Okay. On the internal splits, if they aren't, you know, how big, how large, I think it's important to understand that that's key, right? Without working through, you're not going to be able to make that change. So you need, as Pedro was saying, you need to seduce, you need to entice, you need to make this attractive. At the end, the coalition needs to grow. And I think that should be the aim of this. On the private sector, look, my biggest hope in Venezuela, I think in order to rebuild the country, we have oil, which is going to be, you know, a very important asset just to restart growing again.
Oil and gas.
Oil and gas, both of them, yes. But the biggest leverage Venezuela has to start reconstructing. Many people, you know, of course, the international multilateral financial institutions are going to be key, going to be fundamental. But my biggest hope is the private sector, and I'll explain to you why. Because whatever is left of the private sector in Venezuela, which has been shrinking for the last, you know, 20 years significantly, but is the fact that the public sector in Venezuela, is over-indebted. So you can't leverage on the public sector to reconstruct. You have to do it through the multilateral institutions and do that. In Venezuela, the private sector is not leveraged. Unlike other, you know, debt crises in Mexico or in Brazil or in Argentina, the private sector in Venezuela is not leveraged. That means that what you need to put together is a plan that is so credible, okay, that is shifting the country in such a direction that the private sector is willing to leverage. Now, you can work through public policies and through multilateral institutions to allow the private sector to reduce that perception and risk and ensure partially part of that risk. You can work through policies to do that. Well, that's what we need. And I'm sure that if we do that, the private sector in Venezuela is going to respond very quickly. Why? Because you have a lot of idle capacity in place. I mean, of course, we've been depleting our capital stock in such a way that when I see that, I just get really angry. But you can build on that. And that's going to be a huge source of growth. And it's going to be a huge source of bringing back part of our human capital that's gone away. I know there's a lot of anger against Venezuela right now in many countries because we're migrating in a region that is basically not ready to absorb this amount of people. It doesn't have the infrastructure. It doesn't have the job markets to do that. It had before. Now, I'll tell you one thing. Venezuela's transformed the energy sector in Colombia. They're transforming the gourmet and retail sector in Colombia, as well as in Peru and Ecuador. Well, that's great news for those countries. It's great news for us, too, because they send money back. So we're gaining also from those productivity gains in the region, indirectly through remittances. But we need to get back these entrepreneurs. We need to get back this capital. Without that, we're doomed. We're doomed. Thank you very much.
All right, so we're running out of time. So what I'm going to propose is we take one last round of questions, and then every panelist will have 1 or 2 minutes to give concluding remarks in response to the questions. How about that? Keith, in the back.
Yeah. Just a real quick question. So there's a lot of unmobilized actors in this negotiation, but two I'd like to ask about is the UN and the Vatican, UN and the Church, whether they could be mobilized in an effective way.
Great. And I saw there's another hand up there.
Thank you. It is clear now that the negotiation would be not between two political groups, but one of them is so entangled with illegal and terrorist groups right now that those groups will be defining their agenda. So how to get a negotiated solution having that into account?
Great. And then we'll take this last question here in the back.
Hi, I realize this isn't immediately on the table right now, but I would be curious to hear your thoughts on transitional justice and especially, civil society being so nervous about what's going on, how a plan could perhaps be developed once hopefully things get back on track.
Great. So let's stop there, and we'll just go, starting with Edom, we'll have everybody have 1 to 2 minutes for final remarks.
One short comment on the Keith's question, the role of the Vatican and the United Nations and the role of the international community. For us, there are two main actors on the Venezuelan problem and solution, which are the United States of America and Russia. And in our opinion, those two actors, because of their economics and geopolitical interests in Venezuela and in the region, should be more openly involved in negotiations in Venezuela. And besides these two most important actors, there is the Norwegian mechanism. So Norway, the Kingdom of Norway, can help the negotiation process, and why not the Vatican and the United Nations. We have been talking with Cardinal Parolin at the Vatican, and they should get involved in a clear, realistic negotiation. Thank you.
Well, just to make some final comments on the future reconstruction of Venezuela. Hopefully will begin soon. Yes, we care about diversification. Since Venezuela became a key oil producer and actually the first oil exporter in the world, 1925 until 1970 was the first oil exporter, there have been since the early 30s attempts to start diversifying the Venezuelan economy. We need to do that. But in the short term, Venezuela will be in the emergency room of a hospital. What it needs to recover is what it does best, and it has a large infrastructure, oil and gas, because it will be, again, 90% of oil revenues. And we will need to restructure 150 billion in debt, finance a stabilization plan together with multilaterals, and also make an engine of growth, because the recovery of the oil sector with oil partners from all around the world will help to recover the private sector. In fact, one of the issues of discussion with the Chavismo in the Boston group tables is that some of them used to see the oil sector as the isolated mining sector of the mid-20th century. One of the key issues the oil companies have said to us is fix the macroeconomy, put the private sector to work, and we can do the job of getting back quickly to 2 million barrels and then target 3 million barrels. Okay? So it's going to be a task of short and medium term. But in the short term, we're all concerned of how to finance humanitarian support, social programs, recovering oil and non-oil infrastructure, and paying debts and reorganizing public finance. It's really an epic plan. It can be done. Again, we will have to talk to Chavismo, or what remains of Chavismo, if they goes away. There will be moderate Chavistas. They will be there. Therefore, one thing I really try to avoid is the approach that some people in Venezuela took about thinking that they could reorganize the whole country on the basis of a political plan of a partiality in Venezuela. That is not going to happen. And then we have the army. And the army has also ideas on oil and economics. From nationalism, we might be moving gradually to open up the oil sector, but gradually, not make it, because there is a nationalistic movement in the army. So these kind of things have not been understood well and has been now part of the issue. So despite that we are not negotiating a political solution over this month, the fact that we are negotiating on oil on the economy with Chavismo, I think is going to be extremely helpful for that task that will come after we get to a point where we discuss how to change the actual situation.
I am a bit less pessimistic than some of our partners, and I prefer speak about a crisis in the negotiation instead of a collapse of negotiation. I think that all negotiations have crises, more or less deep, but it's normal. In a situation as the Venezuelan situation, as a Venezuelan one, it's normal, absolutely normal, that this kind of things happens. I think that the negotiation must restart with Norway as an intermediary. It's the best possible, I think. But perhaps we have to invite some other people. Russia and the United States as friends of the process, if they are in this position to be friends of the process. But also a representative as observer, the UN Secretary General. But is for put more pressure on the parties because the importance of the format, but also because United Nations should be probably the main actor in the phase of verification of agreements. And we need the presence of UN Secretary General. UN Secretary General follows the Venezuelan situation very closely. But he has a problem. He don't have the unanimity of views of the permanent members of the Security Council. That's a trouble for Secretary General Guterres or anybody else. I think, yes, that the UN have a role and has a role, and the presence of a representative of Secretary General in a future process of negotiation, I think could be a very important asset for the progress and the verification of the agreements.
I think I'll take my 2 minutes to stress the idea of the unity of the actors that are in favor of a peaceful and democratic way out, that we need much more unity, much more work, and not only because we have a division in the political parties that has to be overcome in order to strengthen their possibility in a settlement, but also because civil society is still too fragile and is still not visible enough backing a peaceful settlement. I've been going to meetings with them, and some of the groups are very clear that we have a crisis of human rights, and the only way that we can overcome this crisis of human rights is through the reestablishment of a democratic system in Venezuela. But from there to take the step to go into politics for the NGOs and for the civil society in general is very difficult. And in some cases, it's not going to happen. But in those especially focused on human rights, basic human rights like life or the free press, they are very conscious of the need, and they have been integrating into some platforms of civil society like the one I mentioned. But there's a lot of much more to be done. And I think that would give the trust to the people that today in Venezuela are basically controlled by the state through fear, through hunger, and through repression. To overcome that, you have to find a leader that you can trust, and that leader has to be strong. You have to feel that he is strong enough to lead you. Because if not, you're not going to go out again to defend him. And finally, I think that if that happens, also the armed forces would be more liable to openly start moving, because there's a lot of discontent there. And the lower ranks, the desertions, you say in English, are by the hundreds. They're starving. I put an example last year that my husband had an operation in the blood bank in the clinic. We had to be operated. They asked us to give some people donors of blood, and so some of the employees that they have at his NGO went to give the blood, and they couldn't give it because nobody had enough hemoglobin in their blood. But then I tell the nurse, what are we going to do? And she says, well, don't worry, we used to have the blood coming here. The soldiers, from the barracks, they used to come here to donate the blood. But anytime they come, none of them have enough hemoglobin to give the blood because they're not eating enough. They're not eating enough proteins. So, this is a very dramatic situation in the armed forces, too. So you can see by that the discontent is there, but if you don't see a reliable, trustful leader, you are not going to move forward. And finally, what I would say, I haven't talked about Cuba here because I don't see him in any kind of settlement in Venezuela. I know he is a key player, that if he would be persuaded that Venezuela needs a political change, that would be practically the key to open the door, no? Because I think Maduro doesn't pay attention to the Russians or the Chinese either. I think he would pay attention to Raúl Castro, but Raúl Castro is not going to do that because his fate is very much tied to Maduro's fate. And so I would just say to finish that we need more unity, to be stronger, to be in a negotiation table, to represent the people that today 80% want that political change, but that we need also to be strong enough so that the lead can be by the Venezuelans, by the domestic realm, because the interests of the other countries have other interests, but our interests have to be the first interests that we have to put on that table.
All right. Well, please join me in giving a round of applause to our panelists from the Institute for Integrated Transitions. Just want to say the work that you all are doing is inspiring, and hopefully we can bring you back in the near future to look at the success of a negotiated transition. Thank you.